Good evening. Welcome to the second keynote event of the SHECP Summer 2020 program, the Baylor Collaborative on Hunger and Poverty, a conversation with Jeremy Everett. I am Ella Powers, a rising junior at Washington and Lee University, where I am majoring in cognitive and behavioral sciences with a minor in poverty and human capability studies and environmental studies. This summer, I am interning with the Common Earth Gardens program under Catholic Charities of Louisville in Kentucky. I have been supporting Common Earth Gardens and their goals to empower and improve the quality of life of refugee families and Louisville communities through agricultural opportunities. These efforts are made possible through supporting community agricultural sites, running an incubator farm business training program, and facilitating nutrition education opportunities. More specifically, Common Earth Gardens aims to connect the farmers to farmers markets, where their fresh food helps improve the health of the community, both nutritionally and by strengthening the community ties. Now, I know we have folks from all over the country joining us tonight. I hope you will take a moment to click through the chat icon at the bottom of your screen and let us know if you're an intern, a community partner, a member school, faculty, staff, administrator, alumni, or friend. As you're doing that, I'll go over just a couple of housekeeping tips. Both your video and your mics are turned off and will be throughout the webinar. Please feel free to submit questions via the Q&A icon at the bottom of your screen. SHECP staff will be monitoring that throughout the event and will summarize and submit those questions to the panelists when we reach the discussion part of our event. Tonight's event will also be recorded for future viewing. To our interns, please be sure to take notes throughout for a discussion with your cohort and inclusion in your Flipgrid reflections. So you take a moment to look at the chat and see who's here. Please feel free to continue to review the chat to learn more about our audience tonight. However, as a reminder, if during tonight's conversation you have questions or reflections for our guest, I would ask that you please submit them through the Q&A button and not the chat. Let's begin tonight's program. The Shepherd Higher Education Consortium on Poverty is an interinstitutional collaboration across 25 colleges and universities, each of whom are committed to offering classroom and engaged learning opportunities related to the study and alleviation of poverty. This summer, 84 interns are learning about poverty intervention strategies through remote partnerships with dozens of nonprofit organizations located across nearly 20 locations. Our summer programming theme, the geography of poverty in pandemic, is leading us through different perspectives about poverty's relationship to location and how our understanding of place can and should inform our strategies toward the disruption of poverty in urban, rural, and suburban spaces. Tonight's keynote features Jeremy Everett, Executive Director for the Baylor Collaborative on Hunger and Poverty, who will join two of our SHEP interns in a conversation about the organization and professional practice that defines food justice work within the larger context of anti-poverty intervention. The Baylor Collaborative on Hunger and Poverty conducts university-based research to determine what anti-poverty efforts are effective and provides the support and expertise to coordinate work in communities, finding solutions to food insecurity that are greater than the sum of their parts. Without accurate, accessible data, we can't make informed decisions about what is best for communities. The data sets are useful for researchers, advocates, policymakers, and practitioners. They're able to provide clean, ready-to-use data sets and informative reports to help drive solutions to food insecurity. To begin our conversation, I am pleased to turn the program over to Dr. Andrew Hogue, Associate Dean of Engaged Learning in the College of Arts and Sciences at Baylor University, who will be introducing our host and our guest for tonight's conversation. Dr. Hogue focuses on programs in undergraduate research, civic engagement, study abroad, internships, and major fellowships and awards. He teaches courses on a range of public affairs, including philanthropy and civil society, social innovation, and politics. Andy pursues research interests related to how we achieve the public good, and he is the author of 2 books, Navigating the Future, Traditioned Innovation for Wilder Seas, out later this year, and Stumping God, Reagan, Carter, and the Invention of a Political Faith. He is presently at work on a 3rd titled Modest Ideas for a Better Public Life. Dr. Hogue earned a BA from Clemson University, an MA and PhD from Baylor, and completed the Executive Program in Design Thinking at Stanford. He has twice been an affiliated professor at Maastricht University in the Netherlands. Andy is married to Tiffany Olson Hogue, a lawyer and Baylor professor, and they have 2 daughters, Anna in 9th grade and Caroline in 5th. Dr. Hogue, welcome, and thank you for participating in tonight's event.
Thank you, Ella. Friends, it's good to be with you tonight. I know we live among many challenges right now, including technological ones sometimes, because I think I just disappeared. Okay, we're back. I know we live among many challenges right now. There are the immediate ones, like working remotely and figuring out how to plan these days that sometimes bleed one into the next. There are the intermediate ones, like, will my university be able to facilitate the kind of education I signed on for in light of all these COVID challenges? There are the swirling challenges, like, can we achieve a world that is just and equitable and fair for all God's children? And finally, there are the existential ones, like, where do I fit and how do I find my way amidst all this turbulence and bewilderment? In light of all this, there are a few things I hope for you. I hope, one, that you are discovering and anchoring yourself to an abiding sense of purpose, a why that animates your minutes, your days, your lives. I wish too for a heavy dose of curiosity and empathy and dedication and imagination as you set out to promote the flourishing of your neighbors, especially those who are most vulnerable or marginalized. And I wish, 3, for people in your life who inspire and challenge you to become someone who's better than the person you are today. I hope you can have friends that you admire. In fact, I can say that it is one of life's greatest gifts to me that tonight I can introduce you to a friend that I myself deeply admire. I've known Jeremy Everett for nearly 2 decades, since we had the chance to work together as community organizers during some of our years in graduate school. Jeremy's the founder and executive director of the Baylor Collaborative on Hunger and Poverty. The collaborative, as you just heard, integrates research and practice through projects such as the Texas Hunger Initiative, the Research Fellows Program, of which I am fortunate to be a part, the Global Hunger and Migration Project, and the Hunger Data Lab, among others. Prior to launching the collaborative, in 2009, Jeremy founded and served as the executive director of the Texas Hunger Initiative, which is a capacity building and anti-hunger project within Baylor University. THI continues to partner with federal and state agencies and numerous faith and community-based organizations to develop and implement strategies to alleviate hunger through research and policy analysis, through education and community organizing. The collaborative is home to 7 regional offices and has assisted local community efforts, increasing hundreds of millions of additional meals to Texans since 2009. They've consulted with more than 40 other states on implementation strategies. Prior to THI, Jeremy worked for international and community development organizations as a teacher, a religious leader, community organizer, and a farmer. Jeremy earned a bachelor's degree from Samford University and a Master of Divinity from Baylor. He's a next generation fellow at the University of Texas LBJ School's Strauss Center for International Security and Law, and a senior fellow with World Hunger Relief Incorporated. And he was also appointed by the US Congress to serve on the National Commission on Hunger. Recently, Jeremy authored a wonderful book, I Was Hungry, Cultivating Common Ground to End an American Crisis. He's married to Amy Miley Everett, who I can tell you is often the only responsible adult in that household. And they have 3 sons, Lucas, Sam, and Wyatt, who are wonderful young men. Facilitating tonight's conversation with Jeremy are Caroline, Saracena, and Camp Sheeler. Caroline is a rising senior at Ohio University from Cleveland, Ohio, studying anthropology with minors in social services and Spanish. Because Ohio University is located in Ohio's only Appalachian county, she has grown familiar with and more passionate about rural poverty, specifically in the Appalachian region. This summer, Caroline is interning with New Roots, a nonprofit organization in Louisville. New Roots has started what they call a Fresh Stop Market movement, in which their goal is to connect food insecure neighborhoods with fresh, local, and organic produce. Post-graduation, Caroline hopes to work with nonprofits and in advocacy work. Camp Sheeler is a rising senior at Birmingham Southern College, majoring in music and minoring in psychology. This summer, he is working with Bread for the World, a nonprofit based in Washington, D.C., that fights to end hunger at home and abroad. Specifically, Camp works in their church relations department, helping maintain communication between Bread for the World and their many partner churches, and helping to facilitate focus groups and listening sessions with the leaders of these churches. Camp and Caroline, I turn it over to you.
All right then, thank you, Dr. Hogue, and thank you, Ella, for the introductions. Thank you again to Dr. Everett for joining us too. I guess a good place to start would be, Dr. Everett, for you to just tell us a little bit about the Baylor Collaborative and what you guys do, what you're working on nowadays, maybe a little bit how you got started there, what led you to that point.
Yeah, well, can everybody hear me okay? Good, okay, well, great. Well, it is great to be with you all, to join you tonight. It's great. It's been great to learn more about the Shepherd Poverty Consortium from Stephanie, and to hear all the great work that you're all involved in over the course of this summer, in spite of the fact that many of us are relegated to our homes, and that you're finding ways, unique, creative ways to advocate or to integrate your work on behalf of communities, in spite of the fact that maybe we have limited access in ways that we didn't originally plan, for sure. So thank you to Stephanie Roth and to Camp, thank you, and Caroline. And of course, it was also very generous of Andy. His introduction was always too kind, and he is right that my wife is probably the only responsible adult in the house. Fortunately, she's here right now. Otherwise, you might see 3 boys climbing over my shoulders, trying to get some attention. But it is good to be with you tonight. So the Baylor Collaborative on Hunger and Poverty is we really kind of have a 3-pronged approach. We work in the innovation space. So it's important for us to think about, okay, if hunger and poverty have been around for, in many cases, the entire length of humanity, then what is it that we can do in an innovative capacity to build public and private partnerships to get the public sector, like the federal government, working directly with nonprofit communities and universities and businesses and community-based organizations together, listening to people who are in poverty instead of just trying to serve them, but bringing everybody together around a common table to develop innovative solutions to addressing the issue as one voice. And so that's one thing that we work tirelessly on is in that innovation space. The second thing is in research. And so if we are always looking for scalable solutions so that we can ultimately end hunger and poverty, both in the United States and around the world. I think if you're going to get into this kind of work, if you're choosing to take on a social issue and you're going to give your life to the cause, then you get in it to end it, right? You don't get in it just to make a small difference. You're getting in it because you want to try to end hunger and poverty, both for the people in your community, the people that you know, but also people that you may never get to know. And so in order to do that, you really need to know what research is suggesting. And so you want to know, what is the actual problem? Most of the time we spend a good bit of time trying to develop solutions when we've identified the wrong problem. Many times we blame the poor for their plight. And as long as we blame the poor for their plight, then the solutions that we come up with are probably not going to work, right? So you really need to understand, what is the problem of poverty? What is the problem of hunger? And in order to do that, you need great researchers, people like Dr. Hogue, and many that we get to work with on a daily basis to be able to inform that innovation that we're trying to drive. And then the third area is public policy. So how can innovation and research be in constant communication with public policy? Now, we're a university, we're not an advocacy organization. So as a university, it's our job to help members of Congress or to help federal or state agencies to be able to make informed decisions. And so we want them to be able to know, okay, if we choose path A, what are going to be the ramifications, both good and bad? If we choose path B, what are going to be the ramifications, both good and bad, and so on. Of course, if they ever ask us our opinions, we're happy to help and let them know what they are. But really, for us as an organization, we try to work in those three spaces. And I'll give you one example of a project that we're currently working on. We typically have about a dozen projects that we're operating at a given point that we're testing out. We have field offices all over the state of Texas. And those field offices, we believe in this idea that was popularized during the civil rights movement called incarnational organizing. John Lewis, the leader of the Students for Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, or SNCC, he's now Congressman John Lewis and has been a congressman for decades. They popularized this idea of incarnational organizing, kind of taken after the idea that Jesus lived and dwelt among the people, and so that as community organizers, you should live and dwell among the people. For my own self, I lived in low-income communities for about 2 decades because I felt like it was important to see what was happening after 5 o'clock and on the weekends and build relationships with families. And we believe the same is true for our field offices. So we have field offices around the state of Texas who are immersed in the everyday reality of what's happening in communities. And so one of the things that we identified is that many of our urban strategies to address hunger weren't working in rural America. And so we partnered with USDA to develop a program we call Meals to You. And since we couldn't, when kids were getting out of school in rural America, what we found is that they lived too far away from a summer meal site. And so their parents couldn't drive them into town to just get a sack lunch. And so if we couldn't get the kids to the meals, we had to figure out how we could get the meals to the kids. And so ultimately, we developed a program where we essentially mail a box of food that lands on the porch of children in rural America. We tested that out in East and West Texas last summer, planned to expand that program to New Mexico and Alaska this current summer. But when the pandemic hit, USDA came back to us and asked us to roll that out nationwide. And so once schools closed, we ended up opening up this program to be able to operate it nationwide. And so now we're working in about 40 states and a couple of territories to be able to provide meals directly to the front porches of kids that live in rural America who were impacted economically by this situation, by the pandemic. So that's the kind of stuff that we do, and then that certainly informs policy, and we've got a large evaluation team that's a part of that. So that's essentially who the collaborative is and the kind of things that we work on.
So it's a very holistic approach, focusing on both, not just the symptoms, but also the causes of poverty. People on the ground, but also people, making systematic change.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. A story that I tell our staff is that when I was doing organizing work in San Antonio before this job, I realized that in all of the communities that we had worked in prior, that I had worked in prior to working in that San Antonio community, which included some parts of Washington, D.C., Birmingham, Alabama, certainly Waco, and then in San Antonio. One of the things that we found is that, for the most part, hunger and poverty look the same in every community where you go. Now, there's a different subset of reasons, oftentimes, why people experience hunger and poverty, but oftentimes our approaches are local approaches only. Like we have a very specific hyper-local approach. And that's not always bad, but these issues are systemic in nature. And so I use the analogy with our team that, it's like trying to address internal bleeding with a topical cream. Like, it doesn't matter how much cream you put on your body, you're not going to stop internal bleeding. And so if you want to address these big systemic issues, whether it's race equity issues or food equity issues, gender equity issues, you really have to work on a local, state, and federal level, even in a global context in many respects, all at the same time. And so that's what we're trying to do. It's not easy, but that's what we're trying to do.
Thank you for your response. I love what you said about living and working with the communities that you're working with and living there and being a part of it. That's something that I find really important as well. So I love that you highlighted your experiences there. I'm going to kind of shift into, I guess, our next question here. But Dr. Everett, you've obviously worked and lived in a number of different communities and with a number of different organizations. And you did just touch on how hunger and poverty look pretty similar across the country. But a large part of what we're doing on our end as interns is talking about the geography of poverty and kind of what that looks like across the nation. So I guess I'm just wondering if you could go into more detail about like what are some common trends and themes you see across all food justice and equity work in the United States? That's
a great question. So already I can tell that y'all are much smarter than I was when I was in college. I don't think I understood how all these systems were interrelated, not till many years later. I will say one thing that one experience that I had in San Antonio's West Side, and Andy knows this story well, was we had a little house and we had a couple of neighbors that lived in the neighborhood. Our neighborhood had the best high school in our neighborhood had a 50% dropout rate. That was our best high school. The neighborhood had about 150,000 documented residents, probably another 50,000 undocumented residents. The median income at the time was about $19,000 per household, but typically you had 3 generations sharing a home. So it wasn't just, that the people didn't have a lot of money. They didn't have a lot of money, but they also had a lot of people living in their home. Our neighbors to the immediate left of us had 19 people living in their home, and a little 2-bedroom, 1-bath home that had one little air-conditioned unit in one of the bedrooms. And I remember my wife and I talking occasionally, saying, how sorry we felt for them. It was just, at the time, it was just my wife and I and one of our young sons, and we just felt so sorry. We just knew that every night that there's had to be bodies scattered all over the house when they would go to sleep at night. Typically, the grandparents, the matriarch and the patriarch of the family, would sleep in the bedroom that had the air conditioner unit, and any babies that they had in the house at the time would sleep in that room with them to try to keep them cool on those hot South Texas summer nights. But we remember one day I was driving home from work and I pulled up in our little driveway, and the matriarch of the family was out watering the one little rose bush in between our 2 homes. And she invited me over and she said, Jeremy, come over and talk to me. So I went over there to talk to her, and she said, I just want you to know that our family feels so sorry for you. And I said, well, why is that? She said, it must be so lonely living in that house all by yourself. And I thought that was great. It gave me some perspective. But her neighbor was a woman named Lupe. And Lupe is one of those people whose lives left an indelible mark both on mine and the people in our community. She was a giant in the community. Really, people looked up to her because she had 8 children, and her husband was the only person on our block that had full-time employment at one employer. Everybody else was piecing together as many jobs as they could find with as many hours as they could work during a given week. So it was typical for us to have a neighbor that might have a job working 20 hours at one restaurant, 20 hours at another restaurant, and 10 to 15 hours at maybe at the grocery store down the road. And so everybody's trying to piece together whatever that they could. And so Lupe was fortunate in that her husband had a full-time job somewhere. Now, it didn't make ends meet. They regularly had their power cut off or their water cut off. It was not uncommon for them to not have any food in the house. But Lupe knew the ticket out of poverty for her 8 children was for them to graduate from high school and hopefully go to college. That was her dream, San Antonio Community College for her 8 children. And so every day, she had her 2 wheelchair-bound parents who also lived with her. And so every day, her husband would leave and go to work, and they had one little car, and he would take the car to work. And then she would send her kids off to school and get her parents situated at a local senior center. And once everybody was situated, then Lupe would make her way down to the schools. And she did this every day. And she volunteered not only to make sure that her kids were going to graduate from high school, but all the other kids in the neighborhood would as well. She was a champion for education. She knew that the kids in our community were likely going to end up in the same difficult circumstances if they didn't get that high school degree and hopefully go to college, just like she and her family were dealing with. Well, Lupe got an ear infection, and she didn't have health insurance. Nobody did, for the most part, in our neighborhood. And so she waited until that ear infection got too painful to bear, and then ultimately decided to catch the bus and go down to an emergency room in downtown San Antonio near the Riverwalk that we've all probably seen images of. And when she got there, she sat in the emergency room and waited in the waiting room all day, waiting to be seen, but her name was never called. She knew she needed to catch the bus and get back home before her kids got out of school. But later that evening, her eardrum ruptured. The infection went into her brain. She fell into a coma, and she never woke up. The next day, her husband was sitting on my front porch as his kids were going door to door in our neighborhood, raising money for memorial service so they could bury their mother. He was just sitting there, and he buried his head in his hands, and he just said, "What am I going to do? What am I going to do?" Oftentimes, as practitioners, we put these issues into different categories. We think about food justice, we think about race equity, we think about economic security or economic opportunity. But the reality is, on the local level, in our highly impoverished communities, it's the same family bearing the weight of all of our broken social systems. They're often food insecure. They don't make enough money to be able to pay rent and pay for medication. They don't have health care. They've often been underemployed for generations. And many of them are disproportionately in minority households. So when we think about the geography of poverty and food insecurity and food equity, first we have to really understand that it's the same family, it's Lupe's family, that are bearing the weight of all of our broken social systems. And once we come to grips with that, then we need to begin to think about how do we rally holistically around that particular family. You know, for our organization, our primary job is to ensure that families like Lupe's have access to 3 healthy meals a day, 7 days a week, no matter where they live. Whether they're living in an urban setting like Lupe was, or a rural setting like the families are that we're serving in the Meals to You program. But ultimately, we have to think about, these families are forced to make a trade-off every month. And that trade-off is, am I going to use the limited amount of resources that I have to pay for food, to pay for rent, to pay my car payment or transportation, or pay for childcare resources or healthcare costs? They don't make enough money to be able to pay for everything, so they have to make trade-offs to decide which one they're not going to pay for. Typically, food is the one that they choose to opt out of. Because if they don't pay rent, they get kicked out of their home. If they don't pay their car payment, their car gets repossessed. But if they don't buy food, they experience shame and guilt, and certainly that has a negative effect on their physical bodies. But they're able to try to get by until the next pay period. And so that's what they do. So I hope that answers your question, Caroline.
Yeah, thank you. That was a beautiful story also, really touching and a true testament to what poverty looks like at the local level.
Yeah, it's very clear that I don't know, I guess anecdotal evidence, is sometimes frowned upon, but in this case, the anecdotes about these people in poverty and these people going through the stuff at the human level, personal level, I guess that's one of the most effective ways to just to show what the hunger crisis is. And I think you made that very clear from how you've answered the questions, is that you find evidence like that, from your time in Washington and the times that you have to find common ground, as you did with your book. Have you found that stories like that, your experiences have been a major factor, a major source of, I don't want to say argument, but a source of,
Yeah, I would say that I think part of the experience like that, it's so John Lewis. So I referenced him before, and every year we take a group of students. Well, most every year, we didn't this year because of the pandemic, but every other year we take a group of students at the end of the academic year to DC for a trip called Hunger in America. And that's their opportunity to kind of see and learn how systems work. And systems can be very confusing. So it's like, so how does a federal nutrition program have any impact on people in poverty? And does it really improve access to food for families that need access to food? And if so, how do you come up with a federal program? So we spend time on the Hill, meeting with members of Congress. We spend time at USDA. We spend time in the local community to be able to kind of help them see how all these systems connect the dots. And our students on one of our trips happened to get to spend some time with Congressman John Lewis. And one of the things that he told them, he said during the civil rights era, that he said most people thought that organizers left the South because they were afraid of the physical violence that was going to be done to them. He said that wasn't the case. He said most of our organizers left because of the monotony of organizing, the day-to-day, getting in the trenches, trying to sign people up to vote or to get them engaged in their community, to work for change. It just requires persistent, consistent engagement. I think for that's one of the things that's why I think you need to know why you're doing what you're doing. So if there's anything that you can learn in this time period, both this summer as a part, working with the Shepherd Consortium, or as you finish up school and move on to the next stage of your life, like really kind of finding out the why. My faith perspective is what kind of animates my worldview. It breathes life into why I see the world the way that I do. But it's those experiences like the one with Lupe that help you weather the storm when the monotony gets you, or when things are very difficult. It's those stories that you go back to. As a research university, with a bunch of researchers, and I don't really consider myself a researcher, but I surround myself with a lot of smart people. And for us, part of what we're looking at are some of these stories indicative of what the larger story of poverty looks like? And it just so happens that Lupe's really is. When I served on that National Commission on Hunger, we found that that families, we looked at all of the research that had been done over the past decade, and we found that families that were food insecure in the U.S. And that were regularly missing meals were all forced to make trade-offs. And the number one cause of food insecurity in the U.S. was underemployment, meaning that they were working. So this myth of the lazy poor person who doesn't work and lives off the government, in perpetuity, that was not the driver of food insecurity in the U.S. The driver of food insecurity in the U.S. was underemployment, meaning that people were working, but they were typically working low-wage jobs. So if you make $7.25 an hour, which is the federal minimum wage, and you are able to get 40 hours of work a week, which is very difficult. You typically don't in a minimum wage paying job, but if you're able to get 40 hours of work, that's still only $13,000 a year. even in a place with a low cost of living like Waco, you can barely afford to pay rent, much less anything else if you're making that kind of a wage, much less take care of kids and so forth. So I think these stories are both anecdotal, but they also kind of speak to the larger issue of what research is suggesting as well. And does it cause arguments, or does it help us move to common ground? I think stories, people might argue stats, and everybody says you can make numbers say anything you want. You kind of can, and but those personal experiences that are I'm finding those oftentimes have a way to cut across political divisions and to begin to unify people. I think people respect these difficult circumstances that people are dealing with. So I think that's a way forward to do that.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Great answer.
Thanks.
Pass the mic to Caroline.
So we've been talking, and you've been speaking a lot about the systems that are put in place in our country, specifically ones that oppress like people of color in our Black and Brown communities. And as we know, there's lots of demonstrations and protests happening right now with the Black Lives Matter movement. So I kind of wanted to bring up and ask you, what role does systemic racism play in our food and agriculture system, and how those were put in place maybe, or how they continue to oppress those communities?
Well, that's a great, very pertinent question. I think no doubt our systems that are that have been built upon racism have adversely affect people of color for 400 years, but certainly even in the present time. If you look at the percentage of people that are currently experiencing food insecurity, typically minority households are 2 to 3 times more likely to experience food insecurity in normal times over and above what individuals in white households experience. Right now during the pandemic, that's even been exacerbated. So we've seen, widespread, economic disruption and unemployment, but that is still disproportionately affecting people of color almost twice as much as it is people who are in white households. And so you have to be able to look at that and say, okay, that is evidence for systemic racism. Now, if people still have a hard time getting their mind around it, let's go back to that West Side neighborhood, all right, where I lived and where Lupe lived. So at our best high school, the one Lanier High School that had a 50% dropout rate, that high school is kind of a center point for a lot of cultural activities in that community. It's a really beloved high school. In the time that I lived there in that community, there were no college recruiters to visit Lanier High School the entire time I was there, but military recruiters went every week. So if you want to know what systemic racism looks like, look no further. A few miles away, the high schools that were in the other neighborhoods that were all were very in close proximity to downtown San Antonio, but the ones that were on the wealthier side of San Antonio, now colleges were there to recruit constantly, and they would rarely, if ever, have a visit from a military recruiter. So that's part of what systemic racism looks like. It looks like the fact that one thing that I'm a part of a group of people here in the Waco community, and we're looking at this. We have been for the last 3 years, systemic racism in our community, which unfortunately has deep roots. This is an old cotton community, and basically wherever there's an old cotton community, there's probably deep roots of racism that abide and still in some ways are celebrated. And so our committee has been coming together, kind of looking at these issues in our Waco community, and we brought in the group, the Race Equity Institute from North Carolina, and they were just dropping some knowledge on us. And one thing, so my family comes from poor Appalachia too, Caroline, except they're on the Alabama side of Appalachia. And they were either basically sharecroppers and small cotton farmers with a few acres, or preachers or Baptist preachers. In some cases, both. And so very poor, but many of so that was my grandparents, and they all went off to serve, in World War II. When they came back, they were able to get the GI Bill. And then the next generation was able to get the GI Bill, and so then my family members started to be able to go to college. Well, one thing that the GI Bill initially had a part of it was you could also come back and get a home loan, a mortgage. And that was the first time that mortgages had really been made available to the middle class, to what ultimately became the middle class. Only it was made to the exclusion of African Americans and Hispanics who are returning from war. They also were excluded from, many of the universities at that time were not open to anybody that, outside of being Anglo. So immediately you see a white middle class skyrocket in our country, and you see African American communities and Hispanic communities not only not get access to this excess capital, but then get redlined by banks, which even caused more widespread economic disruption. So all that has direct impacts on food insecurity a generation or two later. Low performing schools, the way that we fund public schools is still, still promotes one school, well over and above another. And so I think those are some of the issues that we're still trying to deal with. And until we right those wrongs, until we essentially have a Truth and Reconciliation Commission of our own as a nation, I don't see us moving past this. We've got to go backwards and admit our sins of the past before we can really go forwards to be able to address those and come up with real long-lasting solutions that can bend us towards justice.
I really appreciate your anecdote about your high school with the military recruitments and the college recruitments, because that's something that I have never thought of before. And unfortunately, I think it's taken a lot of us, including myself, to like really look at how racism works basically at every level of our nation, really. And that's a great example to talk about how it really is a systemic issue, like we've been seeing and learning and educating ourselves. So yeah, that was a great anecdote.
What kind of actions and steps are the Baylor Collaborative taking towards this dismantling of the systemic racism of America? It's not an easy task, obviously.
Right. Yeah, that's a great question. So our work is rooted in a couple of concepts. And one concept, obviously, is you need the incarnational organizing concept. You need to live and dwell among the people. We say all the time that if you're trying to develop a solution for somebody that's not at the table with you, you're going to build a boat that won't float. You've got to be listening to the people. In our community work in San Antonio, we ultimately opened a coffee shop. But we spent 2 years in the community just cultivating trust and building relationships before we moved forward with any idea. And we didn't move forward with that idea until that was what the community said they wanted and were willing to work with us on that issue. And we try to take that same format and we apply it to this model we call hunger-free communities. And so our hunger-free community coalitions are where we go to local communities and we help get the public sector, the local government and school districts together at the table with nonprofit community organizations, faith community organizations, individuals living with hunger and poverty, you name it. We want them around the table because hunger and poverty are too big for any one person or any one organization or any one sector to address on their own. If we're really going to ultimately end these big social issues, if we're really going to bend the world towards justice, as Dr. King said, then it's going to take the best leaders that we have in our nation, our brightest thinkers, and the voices of people who are oppressed by our current broken systems, all working together in a cohort, in a cohesive effort to be able to come up with real solutions that are going to be rooted and sustainable in a way that can drive change for the long haul. And so our community-based hunger-free community coalitions are that for us. And so we really try to have a complete representation on those coalitions so that we can hear from people who are living in poverty and hear from people who are experiencing hunger, and also have the school districts and our city leaders and our members of Congress all at the same table, so they're working together instead of working against each other. Oftentimes is what ends up happening, to be able to help us move towards equity in all ways. So that's one example.
I guess kind of going off of that, and this is a pretty difficult question to answer, but we see like a lot, particularly like younger generations getting involved in these social justice movements. And I think what you said about getting like everybody, we need like our brightest minds and the voices of the marginalized to really come together to make this a reality for us. Do you see this like progressing further? Like, what it looks like on the public policy level and all of that. So I guess the question would be like, how realistic is it to be pushing for the end to systemic racism when there's already so much backlash, I guess?
Yeah. Well, I think if you look back through human history, all of our big major times where we took significant steps forward, certainly as a nation, but even if you look back even before the United States, or even during our tenure as a country and looked at other places around the world, typically when you see major significant change that happens. So as a country, if you think about the abolition of slavery, you think about the women's suffrage movement, you think about the Green Army, or the Tree Army is what FDR created with the Citizens Conservation Corps. You think about all that happened during the LBJ administration with the war on poverty and civil rights legislation. That was all born out of these incredibly difficult, contentious times when it almost seemed like the world was going to split in two, right? I've heard some commentators say that, the Civil War never really ended in the United States. We've been fighting the same battles largely since the Civil War began. We're just not drawing our muskets and pointing them at each other anymore. But we're beginning to even kind of walk that path again, right? And but things are very contentious. But it's oftentimes these contentious moments where we end up seeing significant social change happening and significant improvements made towards equity that come out of these moments. Now, will this be the beginning of race equity? Will we look back at 2020 or 2021 in 100 years and say that was when we achieved race equity? I hope so. Is this when we'll look back and say, hey, look, by 2025 we ended hunger not only in the United States but around the world? That would be amazing. My hunch is that we'll make some significant strides through this, and it's going to be hard, and I think it's going to only get harder. And I think, like John Lewis said to his organizers back in the day, I'm saying to you and all your friends who are organizers and are really, it's your generation that's really the energy behind this movement with Black Lives Matter, with a lot of the LGBTQ issues that we're seeing right now, certainly with food justice issues. You all are awake in a way that mine and Andy's generation wasn't. In fact, in the 90s, we were taught to not care. We were talking that if you care, that's kind of not cool. And so a lot of us had to kind of overcome that cultural mentality that we had during that time period. Now, things were relatively calm at that time in our life. But you all are the energy behind this, but you're going to have find your staying power. You're going to have to figure out, how am I going to be able to keep at this and keep driving change? Because it might take a decade. It might take 2 decades. it likely will take the rest of your life. I met a liberation theologian, a guy named Gustavo Gutierrez, who wrote kind of the godfather of liberation theology, which basically says that God has a preferential option for the poor. And he was a Peruvian priest and had lived among the poor his entire life. He's kind of like a Peruvian Yoda, is how I describe him. He's like 3.5 feet tall, and I'm pretty sure he was 400 years old when I met him. And he was coming through, making his way through Texas from Peru on his way up to Notre Dame to give some lectures. And one of our professors at the time, I was probably not much older than y'all, and one of our professors had him over to his home because he was celebrating his birthday. And I somehow got on the short list and got to go over to the house for Father Gutierrez's birthday party. And after we had conversations and lively conversations around birthday cake, we were making our way from the kitchen to the living room. I asked Father Gutierrez, I said, how do you have solidarity with the poor? And he said, most people think solidarity with the poor is to live like them or to live among them or to work for them, for a summer or for a couple of years. He said, solidarity with the poor, that's not solidarity. Solidarity with the poor is to commit your life to their cause. So if any one of you is very serious about any one of these equity issues, we have had race inequity in our country for at least 400 years, right? It really happened from the first time that European settlers stepped foot on this side of the world. And race equity was happening inequity was happening long before that, on other continents, with other enslaved peoples. And so if you are serious about promoting racial justice in our world, or you're serious about promoting food justice or economic justice, this is something that you are going to have to decide that you're going to commit your life to that cause. Maybe we see big changes in 2 years, and we all look back at this point and we're all surprised and thrilled and elated. And for those of us who come from a Christian perspective, we might think about like the kingdom of God on earth is here, and we'll be excited and we'll celebrate in the streets. But more than likely, we're going to have to commit our lives to this cause. And this is the beginning of a long, arduous process justice will prevail for sure. But it's going to take a long time and a lot of concerted effort. So I got a little preachy. Sorry about that.
On the subject of faith, you said you come from a Christian background, you work for a Christian university. What role does your faith have in the work you do? Just expand a little bit more on that, and especially in an increasingly secular world.
Yeah. Yeah, it's a great question. Well, I'd say, one of the things, so I just wrote a book about some of this, and, when it comes to the issue of hunger, specifically, all major religions address the subject. In Hindu scriptures, that it says to give food is to give life. And if you think about that as a double meaning, when you eat, not only is your body getting physically nourished, but also when you eat, you're often eating with your family or eating with your friends. And you think about the social component of that. And so if you think about people, conversely, who don't have food, not only do they not have food to eat, and does that affect their physical nourishment or their physical livelihood, but it also oftentimes is directly corresponded to the fact that they might be left out of social systems, and so you think about the elderly person who's sitting at home by themselves, and people, maybe they're a part of a Meals on Wheels program, maybe they're not, and they're sitting there isolated. They not only don't have the food that they need to be able to live a healthy lifestyle, but they also don't have that emotional support, that human connection. And so to give food is to give life, I think, is a beautiful passage. In the Quran, it says, if you go to bed while your neighbor goes hungry, you're not one of us. They kick you out. Like, that's it. You're not one of us. And I just think, wow, that is so that's so prophetic, and so it kind of cuts to the quick. Like, you don't have a choice but to feed the hungry. Isaiah, the Jewish prophet says, to spend yourself on behalf of the hungry, and if you do that, your light will rise like the noonday. For me, so I do come from a Christian perspective. I'll read you a short passage. So my book is titled "I Was Hungry," and it's named after the Matthew 25 text. So this is the only scene where Jesus, the only kind of apocalyptic scene or end of the world scene in the entire Gospel of Matthew. Jesus has come back, and he is, and he's called all the people before him. Right, so he's gathered all the people, and he begins to separate the people. The shepherd, like as a shepherd, and he separates the sheep from the goats, the righteous from the accused. And to the astonishment of the people gathered, he said, I'll read just a small passage. He said, so come you that are blessed by my Father in heaven, inherit the kingdom prepared from you from the foundation of this world. For I was hungry, and you gave me food. I was thirsty, and you gave me something to drink. A stranger or an immigrant, and you welcomed me. I was naked, and you gave me clothing, sick, and you took care of me. I was in prison, and you visited me. Then the righteous will answer him, Lord, when was it that we saw you hungry or thirsty? When was it that we saw you a stranger or naked or gave you clothing? When was it that we saw you sick or in prison and visited you? And the king will say, truly, as you did this for the least of these, you did it for me. He says, truly, as you did it for the least of these who are members of my family. So he associates himself or equates himself with people who are in poverty, and he judges everybody else based upon what they did or didn't do to further their cause. And then he goes on to say, to the people that didn't provide them food, he says, depart from me, you that are accursed, into eternal fire prepared for the devil and his angels, for I was hungry and you gave me no food. I was thirsty and you gave me nothing to drink. I was a stranger and you did not welcome me. Sick and in prison, you did not visit me. And goes on and goes. This is the only time that Jesus comes back. And oftentimes as people of faith, we think that it's about what we believe, but Jesus didn't say anything about belief in him. He didn't say anything about death and resurrection. All he did was say that if you fed the hungry, then I've prepared a place for you in my kingdom. And I don't think that we take that literally enough, oftentimes as people of faith. And I think for me, as a person who comes from the Christian tradition, that's something that I'm hoping that I am learning and leaning into on a daily basis. And I hope that that animates my worldview. I know realistically it doesn't more than it does. And that I am as selfish and self-consumed as anybody else, but I hope that impacts the way that I live and the cause that I commit myself to.
Perfect timing, because it's 6 o'clock Central Time. That's the end of Caroline and me. It's our time. We'll hand it over to Ella for the community Q&A.
Great.
Hi, thanks you all for such an informative discussion this evening. I know our audience is really anxious to join the conversation. So as a reminder, you can submit your questions through the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. So an anonymous participant would like to know, there seems to be a push among researchers and advocates regarding food insecurity to move away from using the term food desert and instead say food apartheid to reflect the issue as an injustice and not an otherwise natural occurrence. What do you make of these terms, and which is most appropriate to you and why?
Yeah, that's a great question. Whoever anonymous is certainly paying attention to some common trends right now. And yeah, I think the issue with food desert is both food desert and food apartheid are speaking to an area that is, if you're not familiar with the concept, it's areas that don't have access to healthy food. And so you might think about a low-income neighborhood or a rural community that don't have a grocery store. In an urban neighborhood, you might not have a grocery store, but you might have a number of fast food restaurants. And so oftentimes we think about obesity, and we don't realize that obesity and hunger oftentimes can be two sides to the same coin. And that's because people oftentimes who are experiencing food insecurity, they're not getting access to consistent food. And so when they do have access to food, oftentimes they might, if you think about, if you skip a meal, which I would encourage each of you to do sometime this next week, skip one meal, skip lunch, and think about what you're craving after you've skipped that meal. You're typically not craving an apple, you're not craving something super healthy. You're probably craving a cheeseburger. You're craving something with a lot of carbs. And so oftentimes for our families that don't have access to healthy food and don't have access to consistent food, the one thing that is available to them are fast food restaurants and dollar menus. And so they end up spending the little bit of money that they do have to get full, and to get so that they can go to sleep that night feeling full instead of going to sleep that night feeling hungry and being kept awake, ironically, because of the hunger pangs. And so that's the reality of a food desert, is they don't have access to good, healthy food. There have been a number of studies that show diet-related disease is directly correlative with living in a food desert. So meaning that you might have either food insecurity, heart disease, obesity, or diabetes, all can be correlative to living in a food desert or in a situation of food apartheid. Now, in terms of what language do you use, I think the benefit of the food apartheid language is that it's like throwing cold water in your face. It's just such a surprise. And it helps you frame the context that, wait a second, why is somebody using such strong language to communicate that there is a neighborhood or a community without access to healthy food? And if you think about pulling at a string on a sweater, it doesn't take long to pull on that string on a sweater to realize the social determinants of health and the interconnectedness of issues. If an area is a food desert or experiencing food apartheid, they're probably experiencing a whole host of issues, much like I discussed with my neighbor on the west side, Lupe, and her family. And so typically in the United States, so we had a foundation in Houston that did a neighborhood by neighborhood survey of the entire state of Texas. And they found that if you live in a low income neighborhood, you are likely to die 20 years before people in middle income or upper income neighborhoods. So going back to San Antonio, so the north side of San Antonio and the south side of San Antonio have a 20-year gap in terms of life expectancy. North and East Waco, which are low income Waco areas, and West Waco, which is a higher income area, 20-year age gap. You're talking 20 years. So essentially you're saying that we choose to value that life, the life of somebody that lives in a middle income or upper income home. We choose to value them so much more that we're willing to give them 20 extra years to live over and above people in poverty. So when you think about food apartheid, it's like, wow, that's really startling. And so some of my friends who helped coin some of those terms, I think that's part of what they were hoping to achieve. Per research, food desert versus food apartheid, I think, that's, I think long as we're explaining the circumstances of what a community is dealing with, and that this is one of a myriad of issues that they're facing, I think that's ultimately what's important from a research end. But to get people's attention, food apartheid certainly does that.
Oh, thank you for your insights on that. So our next question comes from Alan Tinkler, SHECP's board chair, and he would like to know, can you share some of the ways you involve community partners in determining research foci? These may be framed through a community participatory process or not, but I'm intrigued to hear about how community members are involved with generating research questions.
That's a great question. And yes, and that's kind of the point of our field offices, is so that we are both, so that people who are researchers, one of our researchers is a researcher named Craig Gunderson. He's the chief food security economist in the U.S. He's based out of University of Illinois, but one of our research fellows. And so Craig is always looking at economic trends, and we want to know what the latest and greatest research is that Craig is coming up with. But at the same time, we also involve a research process that sounds like you're familiar with, what we call participatory action research. And that is where we are listening to the voices of community members on the local level, and they are informing what it is that we're researching. The difference is, in maybe the type of research that Craig does in this participatory action research, is that our researchers are communicating back in real time with what's happening on the local level, so that we're able to improve the way that we engage in a community, particularly if we've identified a strategy that can make significant improvement to access to food or economic security for family members, rather than waiting, kind of like in what's called like a randomized control trial, rather than waiting for several years until the results are completed, and then kind of sharing that with the broader community. And so we try to do both. We think both are very valuable, but we certainly think that it kind of gets back to really you got to understand the question. You've really got to understand what the problem is if we're going to actually develop real solutions that can build lasting, sustainable change.
Thank you. Okay, so our next question comes from Tarita Poole, Assistant Professor of Psychology and Future Poverty Studies instructor at Juniata College. Would like to know, do you, any of you, use particular theoretical frames or lenses when teaching about poverty?
Yeah, that's a great question. I would love to hear some of our other faculty members on the phone. They don't let me too close to the classroom, and they keep us in our research hub. But most of what we do in terms of the frameworks that we operate from are really trying to help our students understand the systems that exist that continue to promote poverty, and helping them understand how to navigate systems, whether that's on a policy level through the public system, or what's happening with nonprofit communities or faith communities, and then how we can build kind of cohesive interaction between those systems.
Thank you. So our next question comes from Joel Clark, the Director of Professional Development at University of Wisconsin-Madison, who would like to know, what would a Truth and Reconciliation Commission look like here in the U.S.?
Yeah. Yes, great question, Joel. And that's literally something I've been thinking about, this week, of course, during this whole period, where we've seen the strong emergence of the Black Lives Matter movement. I think in part it has to, it almost has to happen on three levels. I was thinking about this, like, could Congress, who would ultimately have to probably put together this Truth and Reconciliation Commission, are they willing to be honest enough with themselves to suggest that would be a good pathway forward? And right now, I'm not sure that that's the case. I'm not sure that both parties could agree together to say, this is an important step, is that we need to look back. And I think what they want to do oftentimes is they want to look for, how do we fix the problem, or how do we, what kind of solutions can we come up with, in part because we're afraid to look back. And I think when we're afraid to look back, we're essentially abdicating, responsibility for all the things that have happened in the past to people that aren't on the planet anymore. And I think that does a real disservice to us, listening to people who have dealt with some very difficult circumstances throughout their lives, and listening to the stories of our elders who have experienced this for 40, 50, 60, 70, 80 years. And so I do believe that, on one level, that it can happen is on a local level. And I can imagine our community really sitting together and dealing with and having a Truth and Reconciliation Commission, where where we have to grapple with how certain families ended up with more wealth than other families, and how we celebrate systems. You know, many of us live in the South, and the kind of antebellum system is often celebrated every year, you know, by families, kind of the families who live in the owner's box, essentially, of the local community, that you know, that have lived in a community, and are the celebrated families that have lived in communities for generations. You know, some of us might come from those families, but that's something that we have to grapple with, I think, in order to do that. But I think a good place to start would be on the local level, for us to begin to put these together. And that might be how we can move towards reparations of some kind, whatever that might look like. Maybe even before we could do that on a federal level. But that's just my thought. I really don't know, but that's a good question. I'm certainly for it.
That your response kind of reminds me of when you were talking about the need to listen, and how that's one of the most important and most effective ways to combat systematic poverty. You know, getting everyone together and listening. And I think it just got me thinking that people, that's the big problem, is that people don't always want to listen. You know, a lot of people don't want to look back, and they don't want to look around and listen and see the uncomfortable, unjust things that are happening, because it's easier to just not listen and pretend everything's all right. But yeah, you just reminded me, it all ties back to listening. You have to listen, and you have to be able to, you have to be willing to listen and willing to understand the implications of what you're hearing.
Yep. You know, one thing I think that so my wife and I have been married for 18 and a half years. And that's hard to believe, that we are old enough to have been married for 18 and a half years. And, but one of our biggest, you know, marriage and having children, as some of you know, and some of you will know, you know, it's hard. And one of the biggest breakthroughs that I felt like we've had in our marriage was when she was expressing some feelings that she had been feeling about our situation for quite a while. And finally, even though I could not see her perspective, I was trying to see her perspective, and I couldn't see her perspective. And finally, I had to stop and say, okay, I'm just going to believe that what you're saying is true. Even though I can't completely get my head around it, I'm going to believe that what you're saying is true. And we are going to operate as if what you're saying is true. And I'm going to act as if, and change the way that I operate in our relationship based upon what you're suggesting. And it was one of those, you know, you have a bunch of transformative experiences in any kind of relationship. And that was certainly, I felt like that it kind of led to an aha moment for me in our relationship. And, you know, after time, I did begin to understand. It took me practicing that she was telling me the truth, and for me to really kind of begin to understand her framework and perspective. I think we're going to have to do that. Now, we don't like to listen. You're right. As a nation, that is not our spiritual gift. And we only want to listen to people that say the same thing that we say all the time and agree with us 100%. And I believe, just like we had some revolutionary, nonviolent social action and engagement that was modeled for us by Gandhi and Dr. King during the 20th century, I think 21st century nonviolent social change is going to start with that you're suggesting, Camp, which is just listening. It's listening and choosing to believe that what the other person is telling you is true, and then operating as if it's true. If there's anything that I hope that you do this summer, it's to find somebody that you disagree with and find the truth in what they're telling you. And I don't care if it's stuff that echoes sentiments that you could not imagine being true, but listen to their truth. Find out why they're saying what they're saying, and sit with it and act on it, and see what that does to restore trust maybe between you and somebody that you couldn't ever imagine being in a relationship with or a friendship with, and see what that abiding trust can build and help you towards common ground. If we can do that more often. The problem that I'm a fan of social movements. I studied social movements. You know, I hope that we are participating in one right now. But sometimes what ends up happening is we get so full of being right ourselves and so full of self-righteous indignation that we can't see the truth in what other people are saying. And in so doing, we have decided who is for and against that particular cause, instead of making space for other people that may not have been convinced beforehand to be able to join your side of the cause, or for you to join their side, whatever that is, to help move the world towards justice. And so we have to be able to sit with people and listen to them and hear their truth. And that is slow, that is difficult, but I think that is part of what 21st century nonviolent social change is going to look like. And if we can do that, then I do think we can find common ground. And I think in that common ground, we can move towards a more equitable society. But if we don't do that, we don't listen, and we just keep going about our business, only regurgitating things that we already believe and that make our situation look better than it is, and then we're destined. We're certainly not destined for greatness as a nation. I'll say that. So. Good observation.
Thank you for that wonderful insight again. Another question we have from an anonymous attendee. They'd like to know how can we sustain this work in the absence of an accompanying ideological shift?
Can you restate that a little bit? How can we sustain this work?
Yes.
Okay. How can we sustain this work with an accompanying ideological shift? Is that what it was? I'm not sure if I'm hearing the question as it was intended, but I'll say, in terms of sustaining the work, couple thoughts. One, you do need, so there is a lot of momentum for social change right now, and I do think, if you think about when the Black Lives Matter movement really kind of started, a handful of years ago, we didn't have widespread economic disruption at that point. Everybody wasn't feeling the impact of something. And the pandemic, it has brought the world to a halt. And families, so you think about hunger, most people really can't quite identify with hunger. They can only imagine hunger in Africa, right? So they can't really imagine hunger in America until they went to the grocery store 3 months ago and it was barren. And there wasn't anything on the shelves. And all of a sudden, people are starting to freak out, whether they had money or not, worried, am I going to be able to buy groceries for my family? And then people are really worried, is my job, am I going to be furloughed? Am I going to be laid off? Are we on the verge of another Great Depression where we're just going to see bread lines? And ultimately we have, we've seen the long lines at food banks waiting for food. And so when you think about how do you sustain this, I do think that because of that widespread disruption, the reemergence of the Black Lives Matter movement has created a lot. It's created, this current situation, the current climate has really elevated and escalated this particular issue to the point where it's got traction, it's got energy. And so on one hand, I feel like we have to move very quickly because as a nation, what is an above the fold issue? So if you remember the old newspaper, when you hold in your hand the above the fold, the top of the line issue that everybody's focused on, we change issues rapidly. Just in this pandemic period, obviously in March and in April, it was the coronavirus. By late April, it was hunger. And by May, it was the Black Lives Matter movement. So you really do have to push on this to be able to see some significant social change, while at the same time preparing yourself to operate as if this is a marathon. And so it's difficult. It's a difficult tension. But I do think that that's where, from a faith perspective, prayer and contemplation can be good, to try to center yourself so that you stay centered throughout this period of disruption, because we're fooling ourselves to think that the disruption isn't going to affect our internal lives as well, so that we're operating out of a place of centeredness as we go out and we try to make the world a better place.
Well, thank you. And I think that kind of segues into our last question we have here. So it's, how do you define success for your coalition? Many organizations addressing food insecurity define success by the number of pounds of food distributed. However, this seems counterintuitive, because success at ending hunger would mean fewer people in need of food in the first place.
Yes. I think, how do you find success, and is did we end hunger or not? And are we moving families into, food justice and economic justice are going to be hand in hand. Racial justice, those are all three going to be hand in hand. And have we achieved that justice? And once we've achieved that, once everybody has access to 3 healthy meals a day, 7 days a week, no matter where they live or who they are, then that's when we know that we've achieved our goal. Certainly, when we're looking at interventions, like our Meals to You intervention, we're going to measure how many meals did we serve. And that gives us an indication of, did that particular intervention, was it fruitful? But if you think about justice, if you think about how to, ultimately that comes back to, like I said at the beginning, it's committing your life to the cause and trying to end that social injustice that you feel called to during your life period. So for me, it's food and economic justice that I know that I've been called to address, and that certainly, if we achieve that before I die, that would be awesome. Doable, but that would be awesome.
Okay, it looks like we may actually have time for 2 more questions.
Okay.
So we'll go ahead and just do 2 more. So the question is, Ken Anderson, director of the Hess Center for Leadership and Service at Birmingham Southern College and SHECP Summer Cohort Mentor, said, "I really appreciate your description of the challenges. Yet the kind of disparities described are the things we have known for some time. Why do they persist? From your point of view, what counter systems make addressing these challenges so difficult? Why are the solutions so hard to implement?"
That's a great question. Why are the solutions so hard when many of the problems have been persistent for so long? I mean, I think that is that is core to Gutierrez's statement about, that's why you have to commit your life to the cause. And I will say, there's this old movie that, it wasn't old for us. Andy will remember it. Some of you on the call remember City Slickers. Billy Crystal was out kind of doing this rodeo thing, and Jack Palance was this crusty old cowboy, and Billy Crystal was kind of going through a midlife crisis, and Jack Palance says to Billy Crystal, "You got to know your one thing," and Billy Crystal's like, "What is that?" But I think ultimately what we learned through that is that you got to know what your one issue is, and you got to dedicate yourself to that particular cause. In part because, if you look at the big social change agents, whether that's Susan B. Anthony or Martin Luther King Jr. or Gandhi or whomever, most of the time they only got one social issue that they committed themselves to that particular cause. So, obviously Dr. King committed himself to race equity, committed himself to civil rights. And as he achieved some of those goals, and he began to shift his work towards the anti-poverty movement, we know that he was killed. Gandhi got a free India. Susan B. Anthony, women's suffrage. And so I think that really knowing that issue and driving change for that particular issue is core. One person that I reference a lot is a guy named William Wilberforce. William Wilberforce was a 18th century British parliamentarian. and he committed his entire time in Parliament to ending the British slave trade. He ultimately achieved that goal 3 days before he died. But one of the things that one of his biographers noted that was the most important thing that he felt like he accomplished wasn't that he ended the British, just that he ended the British slave trade, but that he ended the very idea that slavery was even an acceptable form of commerce. Because until that point throughout all human history, that was a normal way of doing business. That was a normal economic condition, was to have slaves do the work of the ruling class. And so by changing that law, he ended the idea that that was a socially acceptable form of addressing, of creating or building wealth. And ultimately, I think we're going to have to do the same thing. We're going to have to not only put some systems and processes in place, but we're going to have to end the very idea that hunger and poverty and racism are acceptable social conditions. And if we do, then our solutions will meet that value. Right now, I think one of the reasons that we have not moved to solutions is that we really don't believe that poverty is an injustice. We really don't believe that hunger is an injustice. If we really believe that hunger is an injustice, think about all the people that we've driven by in our lifetime. The people that you probably drove by in the last 2 weeks that you know didn't have food. The people that you know are going to sleep on certain sides of town tonight. They're going to go without food. The kids are going to go to bed hungry. The elderly that are going to go to bed without anybody reaching out to them over the course of the past few days and without any food. Parents that are struggling because they've been furloughed. If we really believed in economic justice, if we really believed in ending hunger, then, and we really believe that those people were just as human as we are, then I think we would develop solutions to ensure that that would never happen again. And so that's why I don't think we've achieved many of the goals and many of the solutions that we've known would work to improve families' lives for generations, and why we know many of the problems that exist, and we keep dealing with the same ones. Hopefully, like Wilberforce, who gave his life to that cause, hopefully we'll do the same, and we'll be able to achieve some social change in a way that our kids and our grandkids won't have to work on the same issues that we're committing ourselves to.
Thank you. Yeah, you said a lot of really great things that are very relevant. So this last question we have here is, what do you see as the connections between food security / food justice and environmental sustainability? Are there solutions that can bring increased food security to people while also building a sustainable future environmentally?
That's a great question. Normally this question is presented in a dichotomous capacity, right? It's big ag versus, small ag. And it's how do we, if oftentimes sustainability is thought of as the small farmer, who is living the Instagram life. What was that movie that just came out not too long ago? I forgot the name of it. In the California farm, where they took an old dilapidated farm and they redid it. The Big Little Farm, I don't know, something like that. But it kind of creates this fairy tale world of a symbiotic relationship between farmer and animal and plant, and that is a good goal, and it oftentimes casts big agriculture in this dark, conniving light. The reality is that, in my opinion, is that both are very needed to move the world towards sustainability, both from a food justice standpoint as well as a sustainable, like how do we do sustainable agriculture? I know farmers. I lived on a small organic farm and still have strong ties to that farm. Jonathan, one of my good friends, now runs it. Andy and I are out at that farm some, and I love what they're doing. And sustainable agriculture is core to their model. but I also have a lot of friends who are farmers who are having to farm thousands of acres at a time. And many of my food security friends who work on food security issues in a very global sense are thinking about how do we produce enough food for a growing population. And so certainly we've got to take care of the soil, and certainly we've got to be wise about what we're putting into the soil to be able to take care of the soil in order to help, generate an environment where we're growing food for families and individuals in perpetuity. I don't think that those two things are dichotomous. So I don't think small farming and big farming have to be dichotomous. I do think that since President Lincoln, we've invested in a system that promotes big agriculture in our nation, and big agriculture is showing that it has some significant weaknesses, particularly during this pandemic, when you've got 4 major companies who are doing all of the meat processing in the country, and they get closed because of the COVID-19 outbreaks, in their processing facilities. And so what would it look like to have smaller processing facilities back in the local community like we used to? How would that create jobs? But also thinking about how do we continue to grow more food and develop equipment that can allow us to do so, recognizing that our world is, could double or triple in population over the next 50 years. So great question, very difficult one. Just don't think it has to be a dichotomous situation.
Yeah, we've definitely got a lot of work to do ahead of us these next 50, 100 years. But thank you for the work that you're doing. And thank you all for joining SHECP tonight for our second keynote event of the summer. Special thanks to you, Jeremy Everett, along with Dr. Andrew Hogue, Caroline Saracena, and Camp Schuler. To learn more about Jeremy's work around food justice, I encourage you to check out Jeremy's work, including his most recent publication, I Was Hungry: Cultivating Common Ground to End an American Crisis, published in 2019, which you should be seeing on your screen right now. Before we go, please save the date for our next keynote event on Wednesday, July 15th, which will feature project directors from the Kellogg Foundation who will be talking about their work in partnership with the Navajo Nation, as well as their work in Haiti during the COVID-19 crisis. Best wishes to each of you, with hopes for good health and continued vigilance as we work to advance justice and human dignity for everyone. Good night.
Thank you.
Thank you, Jeremy. Thank you, everyone.